The question is that this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Aston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill abolishes a good program, the education tax refund, and replaces it with a fistful of dollars designed to shore up the electoral prospects of the Prime Minister. The bill itself should be called the Sugar Hit Bill, because that's exactly what the intent of this bill is. And make no mistake, it's actually about two things, and they're not to do with education. The two things are that it's about trying to compensate for the carbon tax, the world's biggest carbon tax coming the 1st of July of this year, and it's trying to add to the pretence that the government has some sort of economic credibility by delivering a budget surplus next financial year. I'll get to those 2 points in a minute, Mr Deputy Speaker, but let me get to the substance of the bill in front of us first. The bill itself firstly abandons the education tax refund. Now this tax refund was specifically designed to assist families with their education expenses. And Mr Deputy Speaker, we support that intent and we support the education tax refund because, as the member for Fowler pointed out, many families are doing it tough at the moment, and we know that education expenses have been going up. There's uniforms, there's school fees, there's textbooks, there's drama, there's music and all sorts of things that families need to pay for. So we're a strong supporter of the education tax refund to enable families to pay for those measures which specifically are tailored towards helping their children go to school. In fact, so much so are we supportive of this measure that we took to the last election a policy to increase the amount of money which people could claim against that education tax refund. But it was based, Mr Deputy Speaker, on an important principle. And it's the principle that the other side of this chamber have great difficulty with. And it's the principle of accountability. And it's accountability to the taxpayer who is paying for the payment, and it's accountability on behalf of the recipient to spend it according to what the desires of that payment was. And so the design of the education tax refund was quite simple. You simply had to collect the receipts of the items which went towards the education of your children. That was all. It's no great burden. If you go and buy textbooks, you get a receipt, you put it in your pocket, and then you can claim it back against your taxes and get a refund at the end of that financial year. That's what it required. And what that did, Mr Deputy Speaker, was two things. First of all, it created an incentive for people to actually spend the money on education rather than other things, because we think that's a good thing. And second, Mr Deputy Speaker, it created an accountability mechanism so that we ensured that the money which was set aside for the education expenses actually got spent on education expenses. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are in favour of this. We are in favour of supporting families with their costs of education. And so much so, Mr Deputy Speaker, that, as I mentioned before, we took to the last election a policy to indeed increase the amount of support provided to each family up to $1,000 for each secondary school-aged child and $500 for each primary school-aged child. And by contrast, the Labor scheme provides only $820 for each secondary-aged child and only $410 for each primary-aged child. But what this bill does is remove the linkage between the payment and education. That's what it does, because no longer do you have to collect the receipts, no longer do you have to ensure that the money has to be spent on education in order to receive that payment, but rather the payment just gets delivered directly into your bank account to spend on whatever you like. And Mr Deputy Speaker, we have seen this before. We have seen this before because we've had a pattern from this government, and we know through the GFC that there was $900 cash splashes which was provided to families. And yes, many of those families used it for the right purposes, to help them with their their food costs and with their accommodation costs and other costs that they were struggling with. But we also know, Mr Deputy Speaker, that a lot of that money was indeed spent on flat-screen TVs in China. It was spent on holidays. It was spent on some other unsavoury things, which I don't need to mention here. And it was spent, Mr Deputy Speaker, it was given to dead people. It was given to people who were overseas. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm concerned that exactly the same thing will happen again here. Yes, a lot of people will use it for education costs, but there will also be people who use it for things other than the costs incurred for the education of their children. There will also be payments, which I am sure, which will be made to people who are now deceased. There will be payments who will be made to people who are living overseas, Mr Deputy Speaker. And this is our concern. It breaks the nexus between the payment and the purpose for the payment, and consequently this core concept of accountability gets thrown out the window. Accountability, most importantly, for the taxpayer who is paying for this payment. They're the ones that are paying for it. It's not the Labor government paying for it, it is the taxpayer. They deserve accountability to ensure that their hard-earned dollars are going to where it's supposed to be delivered, and it's accountability on behalf of the recipient of that money to ensure that they spend the money on the purpose to which it was intended, Mr Deputy Speaker. But let me now go back to what this bill is really about. And as I said at the outset, it's really about two things. Compensating for the world's largest carbon tax coming to all families on the 1st of July, and it's about trying to add to the pretence that there will be a budget surplus of next year. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the carbon tax, the greatest carbon tax in the world, will hit every single family on the 1st of July this year. This was the tax which was supposed to reform the economy, according to the Treasurer. A clean energy future was going to occur, a transformation of Australia. But it's funny, Mr Deputy Speaker, it didn't get mentioned once in the budget speech. It's funny that. This was the big transformation of our economy. You'd think in the 14 pages, the half-hour speech, that the Treasurer might mention it once. No. But no, it doesn't mention the carbon tax, and we know why. We know why, because it is toxic. It is politically toxic for this government. And the reason it is politically toxic is because it puts prices up for every family across Australia, and it will cost jobs across Australia, Mr Deputy Speaker. When you look at the government's own figures, the carbon tax will increase electricity costs by 10% in the first year alone. According to the government's own figures, it will increase gas costs by 9% alone. It will cost jobs across Australia. The Victorian Treasury has done some analysis, and it says it will cost 24,000 jobs across Victoria. In my electorate alone, it will cost 500 jobs. And the reason why that occurs, Mr Deputy Speaker, is because it penalises our businesses but doesn't penalise the businesses that we're competing with from overseas. So a manufacturer in my electorate, which is struggling already with the high Australian dollar and fierce competition for China, will all of a sudden be imposed with additional costs, but the Chinese manufacturer will not have those additional costs. It operates like a reverse tariff, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is why it is poisonous, because it is bad policy. And of course it is based on a lie. It is based on the prospect that where the government went to the election promising that it would not introduce this carbon tax, and what does it do? As soon as it gets in, it introduces it. And this bill is all about trying to provide a little sugar hit to divert the people from the carbon tax which is coming your way. But of course it won't compensate for less jobs. It won't compensate for the higher prices which will be coming from the 1st of July. It certainly won't compensate for the continuing increase in prices which will occur, because the carbon tax is legislated to increase from $23 up to $29 in the first 3 years alone. Mr Deputy Speaker, it can't compensate for those things, and the government should not pretend that it will do so. Mr Deputy Speaker, the other thing that this bill is actually about, and the member for Menzies touched on this, is that this bill is trying to add to the pretence that the government is reining in its expenditure and is getting on top of its debt and will deliver a surplus in 2012-2013. And how this bill, and the trickery of this bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that it brings forward some of the costs from the education tax refund, which was supposed to be incurred in 2012-2013, and brings them forward into this financial year. Mr Deputy Speaker, that's what this is occurring, because under the previous scheme you had to collect your receipts, you'd put them in, and the payment would come next year. But under this measure, a payment will be delivered in June, immediately, and that's why there's a great rush now to get this bill through the Parliament, to deliver the payment in June, because the government doesn't actually care about the expenditure. It only cares about the paper projected budget surplus of next year. And indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, if this payment was put into next year's budget, then half of the $1.5 billion budget surplus would be gone. And of course, this is not the only piece of accounting trickery which is going on, as the member for Menzies pointed out, but there is all number of other pieces of accounting trickery occurring in order to give the pretence that we'll have a budget surplus next year, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the key thing, of course, about a budget surplus is that it's not just to try to give the pretence through a bit of paper that they've got the spending under control. But running a budget surplus, we advocate for that because primarily it is intended to stop a government spending money beyond its means. That's why we advocate for a budget surplus, is because it puts limits on the government expending money beyond its means. But the government actually doesn't care about that, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that's why we've seen this financial year's budget deficit balloon out from $12 billion to $22 billion to $37 billion and now to $44.5 billion for this financial year. And it actually doesn't care about that, Mr Deputy Speaker, as long as it has the pretence that next year it will slightly get this $1.5 billion surplus. But Mr Deputy Speaker, the other thing that I would mention is, of course, we will not know whether they actually deliver on this budget surplus until the end of next year. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we know for sure that they will not deliver. And it's interesting that we have the member for Fraser in the chamber. And the member for Fraser, of course, has been a big advocate at looking at betting markets to determine what is the most likely outcome in politics. And he suggests that that's a very good predictor of what will occur. And in fact, the betting markets today have the odds on will the government deliver a budget surplus, not just project one, but actually deliver one in 2012-13. And Mr Deputy Speaker, the odds of them actually delivering a surplus is about $4, or maybe it's $5 now. The odds of them delivering a budget deficit for 2012-2013 is about $1.20. i.e. the markets themselves suggest there's about a 20% chance of them actually delivering a surplus, even taking into account all of their accounting tricks. And maybe the member for Fraser will be able to comment on that, because he has written extensively about how the betting markets are very good predictors in politics. And the betting markets are saying that there is about a 20% chance that they will actually deliver a budget surplus next year, even taking into account their accounting tricks, Mr Deputy Speaker. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, let me summarise. This measure before us is poor policy because it takes away the link between the payment and the actual intent of the payment. That's the first point. And it's also poor, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it's based on accounting trickery, trying to bring forward payments from next financial year into this financial year. And thirdly, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's actually all about trying to create a sugar hit for the carbon tax, which is going to hit all families on the 1st of July this year.
Thank the member for Aston.